consequences and accountability when it comes to our kids at home and in school. So giving our kids consequences and holding our kids accountable is not the easiest thing in the world to do for parents or for teachers. I think the best place to start is making sure our kids know right from wrong. Because if our kids know right from wrong, it's easier for us to hold them accountable because they should know better. So when it comes to accountability, we have to look at our child's intent. We have to figure out if their intent was to break the rules, doing the wrong thing on purpose, or if they just didn't know. And whether or not what they were doing was intending on hurting someone else's feelings or to deliberately do the wrong thing. And once we establish that, it's easier to give kids a consequence for their actions. I think the biggest struggle for parents is knowing what consequence is going to work for their kid, but also having that extra added pressure of what other people think. And it's shitty for parents because we constantly have this overriding judgment and expectation from society to do the right thing when it comes to our kids. And it's hard. So by teaching your kids right from wrong, it allows you to discern right off the bat how you need to move forward with your kid when it comes to consequences and holding them accountable. If it was deliberate, well, that takes you down a different path. If they're deliberately doing the wrong thing or if they're deliberately trying to hurt somebody's feeling. If it was unintentional and they did the wrong thing because they didn't know better, well, that's where the teaching piece comes in. And I just want everybody to know that the teaching piece has to come in all the time. It should never not be there. I think one of the things that parents and teachers lose sight of when they go to punishment or discipline is they lose sight of the teaching component in the sense that they're trying to develop character. And we often use discipline and punishment for fear, and we want our kids to be too scared to do the action that they did to start with. And if they're afraid of the punishment and they're afraid of the discipline, they won't do it again. That's an external motivator. And when that external motivator disappears, data shows, science shows, research shows that they'll more than likely do it again. So what you want is you want to make sure that you're intrinsically motivating these kids as much as possible. So yes, you may raise your voice, which is okay, or use a stern voice, show your child that you're a little bit frustrated with them. That's okay. But you need to take deep breaths yourself, and you need to calm the situation so you can have a conversation and hold them accountable and provide a consequence for them. But again, that comes back to teaching right from wrong. If your kid doesn't know wrong and you're giving them shit and you're trying to discipline them and you're trying to hold them accountable and they don't know better, that's on you. So teach that. When you teach kids about right and wrong, you're teaching them to be mindful, you're teaching them to be empathetic, you're teaching them to be considerate, you're teaching them to think before they act. And the other key is that when kids act up or they misbehave, we need to hold them accountable. Almost every time. Sometimes you need to let them work through the poor behavior to see if they'll bring themselves back around, to see if they'll do the right thing on their own without any guidance or co-regulation. However, when it is misbehavior, we typically need to step in and remind them about what the right thing to do is and send them on the right path. And depending on the severity of the behavior is going to depend on how long or how much you need to take in terms of time and what type of consequence you give them to hold them accountable. My suggestion is to always have a consequence around accountability that revolves around restitution. And by restitution, I mean giving back to the household, giving back to the school or the community. So for example, in my school, if I have a kid act up, they might have to clean up the calming space. That's where kids play. There's Lego, there's cushions, there's Connects. They build forts. And so that kid might have to come in and clean that up. And if the behavior is one where they weren't being empathetic and they weren't being very kind to another person, they might sit in the thinking chair first and reflect, because reflection is key, and reflect on their actions. And then after they've sat there and thought about their actions for a while, then you provide the consequence, which is restitution. You know, at home it could be they got to shovel the dog poop, they got to wash windows, they got to sweep the driveway, they got to fold the towels or do the dishes a little extra. And most families do have chores, but you can add on to their chores through restitution if there's a consequence needed for their behavior. But essentially, you want to hold your kids accountable by providing a consequence. And you do that by making sure they reflect, by making sure they do their restitution, but following up with a conversation around the why. But why didn't they do the right thing, or why did they do the wrong thing? Or figuring out if you actually even taught them the right or the wrong thing to make sure they don't do it again. And we don't want to teach our kids that when they screw up or they make mistakes with their behavior, that we're going to take things away that they love, that they're passionate about, or that they have intrinsic motivation for. We don't want to do that, because intrinsic motivation and developing passion are incredibly crucial to our kids developing character. So please don't do that. Don't take away things that they love unless they're materialistic. Because ultimately, what we want kids to develop passions and intrinsic motivation, and to do the things that they love, because that's where discovery learning comes in. That's where experiential learning comes in. And you want to tie learning into your accountability and your consequences as much as possible. The other thing I want to talk about is parents and teachers whose default response is no. And a big problem that we have with kids is they have temper tantrums or meltdowns when we say no. And the reason is because we say no too much. I know that sounds contradictory, but if your default response is no, and that's what your kid is used to, eventually they're going to get frustrated. So here's a rule of thumb for you. Instead of saying no, try to say yes more often, especially, and this is where I need to separate it. You want to say yes when it comes to experiential learning and discovery learning, creativity, critical thinking, intrinsic motivation. So if your kid has an interest in something like magic, for example, you want to encourage that. And if they're asking you, can I have a magic kit or can I have this? You want to go along the lines of, yes, let me support that passion. Which is different from when you're in the grocery store and they want candy or they want something else. You have to separate their wants from their needs. Same thing with us. We have to separate our wants from our needs as adults. Do I need that or do I want that? And with kids, if we say no to their needs when we should be saying no to their wants, we're going to create frustration because they won't get it, because we're trying to develop character. As a parent and a teacher, I try to say yes as much as possible, unless it's a want, unless it's a superficial thing that's not going to impact them. And sometimes I say yes to that too. And typically the problem when it comes to saying no, and I see it all the time, I see it in grocery stores, I see it at schools, I see it on playgrounds. I see parents saying no, the kid whines, they throw a fit, and then the parents give in. And that's why saying no too much hurts, is because parents give in too much, and eventually the no means yes, and the kids figure out in a hell of a hurry that if they just whine or cry or complain, that eventually you're going to say yes. So your no really means yes. Hence the reason why you should start saying yes more often and no less. And then when you do say no, you stick to it. And if your kid melts down, if they whine or complain, you have to ignore it. Even to the point where you have to hold them accountable for their childish behavior. go and sit in the thinking chair, and I want you to think about why you're being emotional right now. Think about and label that emotion. Why you're frustrated, why you're angry, why you're sad. And is it the right or the wrong thing to be feeling at this point? So, more often than not, parents, try saying yes instead of no, because when you do say no, it'll be meaningful and it'll be easier for you to stick to your guns and not bend or break when your kids have a temper tantrum. If your kid does have a temper tantrum and they melt down, let them. Put them in the thinking chair and let them know. Say when they're ready to speak and have a conversation, you'll be over here. Let them cry, let them kick, let them do what they need to do. And eventually, they will take some deep breaths. And that's what you need to do as well, is you need to co-regulate, encourage them throughout. Say, take some deep breaths. When you're ready and when you're calm, we can have a conversation about what you're upset about. And eventually, it might take 10, 15, 20, 25 minutes. They'll calm and they'll work through it, which is doing two things. They're showing the child that no means no, and they can work through big emotions. And you can co-regulate that. And then you can have a conversation and you can talk about character, and you can talk about wants versus needs. You can talk about right versus wrong. And then again, at that point, you can decide whether or not their meltdown or their behavior warrants a consequence. Restitution, going outside to shovel shit or sweep the driveway, taking the garbage out, or if it just requires a conversation. And again, you decide the consequence based on right or wrong. If their intent was malicious, if their intent was hurtful, if their intent was to just be a jerk, or if they just didn't know any better and their emotions got the best of them. Because kids and adults, our emotions will get the best of us. And we need to think about that as well. So, to sum up, consequences and accountability. Accountability is holding your kids accountable for poor behavior if they did the wrong thing. Consequence is the action you attach to their behavior for doing the wrong thing. We need to teach, help soothe, and hold them accountable. Anyways, I am signing off from Campbell River. By the way, Campbell River is beautiful, and I'm going to be back every summer. Peace out, Campbell River.